Thank you for joining. So today I want to start with the actual text of the Hanya Shingyo. Let me share the screen. For those of you who don't have the link, I will put it into the chat function. Or if you watch this later on the video, the link should be also in the video description. So it's the Chinese text of the Hanya Shingyo together with an English translation by Thich Nhat Hanh, and you can also find it at this link here on the internet. I think Thich Nhat Hanh made at least 2 different versions, and this one is the newer one, so he explains also why he thought that a new translation was necessary. The title of the sutra is Mor訶般若波羅蜜多心経. I will talk about that in a little bit more detail later, but Maka means, well, big. In Sanskrit it would be Maha, big. Hanya is prajna, which can be translated as wisdom, or Thich Nhat Hanh says insight. Paramita in Sanskrit is paramita, and this is sometimes translated as transcending, transcendence, or perfection, but as Thich Nhat Hanh translates here, it brings us to the other shore, so it also can mean to cross over. And basically what's meant here is to cross over from this world of suffering to the world of enlightenment, nirvana, and where there's no suffering. So the wisdom that brings us from samsara into nirvana. The Shin is usually translated as heart. In Sanskrit, I think it's hridiya, which means something like the essence. So this is the essence of all the Prajna Sutras. There are about 600 volumes, and this is supposed to be the essence of all of them. And as I tried to explain last time, the orthodox point of view is that this sutra, as all of the other Prajna Sutras, came from India to China. But about 30 years ago, there was a lady scholar who said that doesn't make sense. If you look at the translations, if you look at the Sanskrit texts, the only way to make sense of this, that actually this essence was, so to speak, distilled from the texts in China, and they re-imported it later into India. Whatever, this is supposed to be the essence of the text. And maybe after Xuan translates, I will start with the first line, but maybe before that we will have the translation.
Your voice is a little small. It's a little hard to hear.
My volume is small?
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm sorry for that.
But it's okay.
Could you hear what I just said, or should I
Yeah.
repeat it once more?
No, I heard what you say, just a little bit small.
While you translate, I will try to attach a microphone here.
OK，我刚才就是老师声音有点小，我也是有点断断续续。我跟大家说一下大概意思啊，就是老师刚才其实就是解释了就是它的标题。然后刚刚老师说，其实《心经》我们上节课了，就是讲了，应该是从印度传到中国的，但是有一个应该是哪个国家的一个研究的人说，其实就是从他的那个行文，还有从他的那个文章风格来看，不像是从印度的文章翻译成中文的，更像是从中国写好了之后再重新翻译回 印度教的。然后上次也有这种传闻说，就是因为心经它是一代传一代嘛，就是一个人一开始这个那个玄奘他背下来，然后告诉别人又告诉别人，所以很有可能是在大家传授当中，就是已经不是原来那个样子了，是转回去的，是翻译回去的，所以也有这种说法。然后刚刚老师说这个标题。这个链接我发到咱们群里面了，它是3个日语的、中文的还有英文的那个在一起的，然后它的全名是摩訶般若波罗蜜多心经。摩訶就是那个麻哈，应该是梵语里面那个就是大的，然后它后边写的那个呃般若波罗蜜好像就是我刚刚没有听太大清楚，应该是智慧啊，然后是呃就是说好像是把我们带到，你看英语它写的是把我们带到另外彼岸，就是好像就是般若波罗蜜就是智慧，把我们带到彼岸的智慧，一个大的智慧的那个意思，大概是这个意思。然后老师说他一会儿会讲第一句啊。
Okay, so let's start with the first line. In the Japanese pronunciation of these Chinese characters would be kanji zai bosatsu gyojin hanya hara mitaji shoken goun kaiku do issai kuyaku. Kaiku ですね。Kaiku do issai kuyaku. And this means Kanji Zai Bosatsu is the name of a bodhisattva who is also sometimes in Japan called Kanzeon Bosatsu, and in India it would be Avalokiteshvara, often called the bodhisattva of compassion. And when this bodhisattva practiced deep prajna, wisdom, paramita, he realized, he saw clearly that the 5 skandhas, and what the 5 skandhas are, I will explain later, probably not today, maybe in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. He realized that the 5 skandhas, basically everything we see and hear and what we make out of that, the whole world that we construct, all of that is empty. And when he had this realization, he was free from all suffering. And what is interesting about this beginning of the sutra is usually all of the Indian sutras start with the words, "Thus have I heard," or with the Chinese characters read in the Japanese way, it would be Nyose Gamon, "Thus have I heard." And these are the words of Ananda, the disciple of Shakyamuni, who was always traveling with him, and he had an excellent memory. He remembered all of the sutras. So about a couple of years after the Buddha died, when all of the disciples came together, it was always Ananda who, from memory, recited the sermons of the sutra that later became the sutras. So basically, he always started with, "Thus have I heard." And then he said, at one time, the Lord Buddha was traveling and he took a rest in the garden of somebody. And for some reason, this is missing here, which is interesting. Probably it's the first sutra where this part is missing. And the Buddha is never mentioned in the whole sutra. The main person, the main character here is Avalokiteshvara. And a second character that appears later in the sutra, in the second line, is Shalishi, or Shaliputra in India. And he was a disciple of the Buddha, and they say that among the many disciples of the Buddha, he was the wisest of all. Actually, in the old sutras, often Shariputra, when the Buddha is tired, for example, during a sermon, the Buddha gets tired, then Shariputra gets up from his seat and he preaches instead of the Buddha. So he was just as wise as the Buddha. He could, in the place of the Buddha, say and repeat everything that the Buddha would say. But Shariputra doesn't say a word in the sutra, but he is the one who's lectured by Avalokiteshvara. He's in the position that he has to hear. And basically what he will hear is that all of his wisdom is denied. Everything is taken away from him. One of the key sentences in the Heart Sutra that probably all of you know is, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And then the sutra goes on to say there's no colors, there's no sounds, there's no smell and so forth. No, no, no. A lot of things are denied here. So first of all, it's important that the whole sutra is preached from the standpoint of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. And actually, it's interesting that in Zen, Bodhidharma is credited with the words, in Japanese, Fulyu Monji. We don't base our practice, we don't base our teaching on the scriptures. We point directly to the human mind. And when you realize your own nature, that's when you become a Buddha. So the Bodhidharma basically said the sutras are not of importance. But still, both in Rinzai sect and Soto sects, we have these sutra books and we recite, if you live in a temple, probably almost daily, sutras are recited. And it's interesting that in many of these, Avalokiteshvara appears. For example, here in the Hanya Shingyo, but then in Zen you also recite a chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is called Kanzeon Bosatsu Fumon Bon, which means the universal gate of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And there's also Dharani that we recite a lot, which is called Daihi Shindarani. And in that you have the words Oliya Bolyokichi Fujisato Boya Oliya Bolyokichi Shifulaya Fujisato. Oliya Bolyokichi Shifulaya Fujisato. And it's almost impossible to get it, but actually the Dharanis are, how do you say, it's the Indian sound, not really translated into Chinese, but the Chinese used characters that sounded similar to the Indian. And in this case, Oliya Bolyokichi Shifulaya stands for Avalokiteshvara, and Fujisato stands for Bodhisattva. So even in this Daihi Shindarani, Avalokiteshvara is the main character. And now the question is, but I'm not quite sure if I get to that today. Who in the first place is Avalokiteshvara? Actually, the Bodhisattva is hanging here behind me, pictured on this scroll. That's one of many, how do you say, pictures or statues that you can find. There's many different versions. Sometimes pictured with 11 faces, sometimes pictured with 1,000 arms. So who is that Bodhisattva who's the main character in the Hanya Shingyo? That's going to be the first important question, but before I get to that, Xuan-san, maybe you can translate into Chinese.
老师刚刚讲了前面的2行，然后观自在菩萨行深般若波罗蜜多时，就是然后后面观见五蕴皆空，度一切苦，应该是念恶啊。然后前面就是讲的，就是这里面他其实提到了五蕴。五蕴今天可能我们没有时间具体讲，可能以后下一节课就是2周以后老师可能会讲，就是五蕴。观音菩萨前面解观自在菩萨指的就是观音菩萨，他在修行特别深入的时候呢，就是看到了五蕴，然后明白了我们其实这个世界一切都是空相，所有的都是空的。 然后就把一切的苦难置之度外了。然后第二句，它前面那个舍利子，其实指的是，就是佛陀的他应该是一个最聪慧的学生。然后这个菩萨对这个舍利子说，就后面这句话应该是最有名的一句话，就所有人都知道，这个空不异色，色不异空，色即是空，空即是色。然后这应该是最有名的一句话了，就是他用四句完整对仗的这个句子全部否定了前面所有我们看到这些东西。然后特别有意思，就是他前面没有提到，因为我们知道其实这个不是佛陀自己说出来的话，是他的大弟子最后阿难达应该是啊，他复述的。但是特别有意思啊，前面没有，就是这儿前面没有那一句，就是我听闻应该是什么那个什么如闻，我是那句话怎么来说？就是应该是他听说的那句话，这个文章里面没有。然后不知道为什么这特别有意思，把它去掉了。然后后面刚刚老师又说，其实就是在坐禅修里面，我们说的达摩祖师，就是他的一个理论说，我们禅修其实是怎么说？就是我们其实不是不基于练习和一些经文的，我们是基于你的意识，就是你的心和意识的。经文不是很重要，但是在日本的像一些禅修的临济宗或者是曹洞宗的，也是采纳一些经文的，就是他们也是在学习经文的。就是这个有矛盾，但是也有不一样的地方。然后就是这篇心经里面有很多地方其实是梵语的音译，它没有直接翻译出来它的具体含义。你比如说他前面说这个菩萨，然后就有一个问题，那他说这个菩萨，观音菩萨是哪个观音菩萨？是谁？是第一位？人称是谁？就是老师刚刚提出来一个问题，因为他没有说出来是谁。
Thank you. Shall I continue or shall we start the Q&A session today? Do you have any questions? Anything you would like to share? Nothing? Then let me continue for just a little bit. I just said that Avalokiteshvara is also featured in the Lotus Sutra, especially in that chapter that talks about the universal gate of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And basically, this whole chapter of the Lotus Sutra is like a prayer to Avalokiteshvara. So if you're in difficulties, just pray onto Avalokiteshvara, and he's called in Thich Nhat Hanh's translation, he's called a he. Although sometimes, for example, also in this calligraphy, the Bodhisattva is more pictured like a woman. So it's actually quite unclear. Well, in the Indian sources, he's an he, but he's male, but he could also be female. So either way, if you ask Avalokiteshvara for help, he or she will help you. And for example, there's this line that says, if you want a child, but you can't have a child, but you ask Avalokiteshvara for a girl, then Avalokiteshvara will bring you a girl. If you ask for a boy, Avalokiteshvara will bring you a boy. So in old times, when it was really important for people to have kids so that the family can continue, when they were desperate and they asked Avalokiteshvara for help, and then they finally had a child, probably the child itself would have been like Avalokiteshvara for them. It would have been as if Avalokiteshvara manifested as the child. But from the perspective of the child, probably it's your parents that are Avalokiteshvara for you. They fulfill all your wishes. And there's a very famous priest in Japan. Maybe I already mentioned him a couple of times. His name is Shinran. He lived at the same time as Dogen, but he was from a different sect, not Zen, but Pure Land Buddhism. And he was the first a priest in Japan that actually officially married about 800 years ago. His teacher was also Pure Land Buddhism, but his teacher was celibate, as all of the Buddhist priests were at the time. And probably Shinran had no intentions on marrying, but he had the strong desire for a woman. So at one time, he prayed to Avalokiteshvara and said, please help me. Please help me. I can't take care of this desire. Please help me. And then a couple of weeks later, he met this beautiful nun and he fell in love with her. And he was convinced that she was Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara had appeared in the form of this nun to save him. And actually, as we know, her name was Eshin, and she wrote a diary. And these diaries still exist today. From her diary, we know that when her husband, they married later, when her husband died, she thought, well, Avalokiteshvara disappeared. So she thought also that her husband was Avalokiteshvara. So when the question is, where's Avalokiteshvara? The answer is you can meet him or her anywhere. On the street, in the supermarket, on the bus. You can meet Avalokiteshvara any place. But what is more important even than that is, even though you might not think so, when people see you, they also see Avalokiteshvara. So for your kids, you are Avalokiteshvara. For your parents, maybe you are Avalokiteshvara. For your partner, you are Avalokiteshvara. So the special thing of the Heart Sutra is, it's not about the Buddha, it's about you. You are the main character in the sutra. So when the Heart Sutra talks about Avalokiteshvara, it's you. You have to put yourself into the position of Avalokiteshvara. Maybe that's the most important thing at the beginning here. And I will talk about the other things like the meaning of prajna and paramita and the 5 skandhas in 2 weeks. So maybe Xuan, after you translate, if you have questions, please ask them.
刚刚老师讲了一个小故事啊，就是这个他讲的有两个菩萨，一个是阿波罗提索瓦哈，然后另外一个是波利萨瓦，一个是观音菩萨，另外一个是什么菩萨？中文我不知道怎么翻译的啊。然后就是关于这两个的故事，就是古代人求就是都喜欢要男孩嘛，所以就是去求子，就是那个阿波罗提索瓦哈，去求子生男还是生女。然后日本特别有名的一个僧人啊，他叫新兰，中文那个汉字我到时候得查一下怎么翻译的啊。在日本特别有名的一个禅师，然后就是他那个时候的日本的和尚，现在日本和尚是可以结婚了，但是那个时候其实也是可以结婚的啊。但是他因为他修行嘛，他不想结婚，所以他就和那个观音，就是那个阿波罗提斯瓦哈，和他就是去求他说，能不能让我不要有这样的欲望，能不能帮我度过这个劫？我不想那个，我不应该有家人，我不应该。然后结果他去许完这个愿望之后呢，几个星期一段时间之后，他就和另外一个特别漂亮的女生，一个漂亮的女的相爱了，然后他两个就结婚了。然后后来，其实我们后来知道了，这个女的她叫 A 心，她也是一个修行的人，应该也是一个叫尼姑吧，应该也是一个。然后她写了一个，是不是尼姑？我得查一下。就是她也是应该是一个修行的人，她写了一些文章。然后我们通过读她那个文章知道了，就是所以这个就是这个新兰这个僧人呢，他和这个女的结婚的时候，他就认为，因为他跟那个和尚，他和那个菩萨去许愿了嘛，他就认为这个女的就是那个菩萨变的。他认为这个女的这个漂亮的女生，这个漂亮的女人是菩萨变的来解救他的，所以他就跟他结婚了嘛。然后后来这个 A 信他写了一个文章，我们通过读他那个文章之后，我们知道了啊，就是他在他就是新兰死之后呢，他写那个文章，我们读了之后，就说他认为好像他之前的那个丈夫是那个菩萨变的，那个菩萨也是来拯救他的。所以你看，他们两个人都认为双方是那个菩萨， 那到底谁是那个菩萨呢？所以我们通过这个故事就说，其实菩萨是你也可以是，他也可以是，在任何地方都可以有。那什么是重要的呢？其实别人看你就是，其实我们都是就是怎么自己是最重要的。比如说，你对你的家人来说，你可能就是他的菩萨；你对你的和尚，你可能就是他的；对你的孩子来说，对你的朋友来说，你可能就是他的菩萨。然后，那我们读心经有一个特别的地方是什么呢？就是说，其实刚刚老师提那个问题，那他说的这个菩萨，到底谁是这个他提到这个菩萨呢？其实老师说，其实你应该把你放到这篇文章当中，你是第一位的，就是其实你也可以是这个菩萨，它是你以你的这个第一人称来叙述的。就是我们要学的，并不是说去寻找一个菩萨，其实每个人都可以是，要把你这篇文章的就是一个特别特点和一个特别重要的地方，就是它其实是把你放在最重要的一个位置上的，你是第一人称。然后大家有问题可以提，然后后面几节课老师可能会说其他一些就是关于什么五蕴什么名词啊，然后今天应该就说到这儿，然后大家有问题可以提。
Thank you. So if you have questions or anything you would like to share, you're welcome to do so. Either raise your hand or start talking right away. Still no questions? Well, you don't have to. You don't have to ask anything if you have no questions. Diane, please.
Hello, Moho.
Hello.
Well, I'm just wondering at NTIG, do they recite the Heart Sutra? And if they do, when and for what reasons?
Good question. Well, I just said that at most temples you recite the sutras daily, but Antaijin is an exception. Most of the days we don't recite the Heart Sutra. Actually, it's only a couple of times during the year. For example, today is the day of the birthday of the Buddha, or at least in Japan. April 8th is the birthday of the sutra of the Buddha Shakyamuni. So sometimes we have a ceremony on this day or on December 8th when he got enlightened. And when we go begging, takuhatsu it's called in Japanese. So we stand on the street and collect alms. And usually we chant the Heart Sutra then all over again. So what's the meaning of that? It's a good question. For one thing, I think it's an expression of gratitude for the teaching. Because without the Buddha and without his teaching, we wouldn't be able to share into this practice of Zazen. Also, the Heart Sutra is something that in Japan people recognize. So when you, for example, chant it when you collect alms, people recognize, oh, that's the teaching of the Buddha. Even if they don't understand what you're chanting, they understand, oh, that's the Heart Sutra. But for me, at least, I think the first reason to recite the sutras would be an expression of gratitude, I would say. And usually when it's done, it's not done like we do it now, that you try to understand the teaching. Often people, when they recite, they just recite it. They just read character after character without even understanding the meaning. But it's not so much about the intellectual understanding than just voicing the teaching.
Thank you.
But then also Bodhidharma said, oh, we don't base our practice on the teachings, on the sutra. That doesn't mean that these sutras wouldn't be able to give us hints. Often there's this metaphor of the finger that points to the moon. Just because the finger is not the moon doesn't mean that it's pointless, so to speak, to point to the moon. And you could say that all of the sutras are like pointers to the moon. You shouldn't confuse them with the moon, but often it's helpful to have this pointer. Or the map is not the landscape, but still it's often useful to have a map if you're lost in the landscape. Any other questions? Anything else that you would like to ask or share?
I thought of a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
What is it where you're sitting there? It looks almost like a Buddha statue behind you.
What is that? It's just a park.
It's a park. It's not a Buddha statue.
I'm outside. But there's Buddhas everywhere in Japan.
It's Avalokiteshvara,
yes. Yeah, I was thinking about the bodhisattva. Idea of the bodhisattva is really interesting and important.
Yes.
Like actually, I went back to I went to the Catholic Church on Easter, and I was talking to a priest, and he knew about Dogen.
Yes.
And some things are similar, like certain things, but like he said, well, like one difference is you have to believe in that Jesus is a mediator between you and God. And then they frame it like that. And then I'm thinking about like, okay, so there's something really different between but on the other hand, if you think about what is the bodhisattva idea, is that like, you're not trying to save yourself anymore. It's like, okay, I am going to, so I think it was Uchiyama that described this. He's saying like, okay, I'm no longer going to try to get into heaven. I'm going to go back into the earth, back into hell, and try to save everybody else first, which is like, then in that regard, it's almost like you're becoming the same. That's kind of what Jesus, that's kind of what the story of the Christianity is, in a sense.
Yes.
And so in that sense, there could be kind of an overlapping similarity, but I don't know if there's a question there. That was more of a comment. And then I was thinking, you do get these paradoxes that show up in Zen and in the Mahayana philosophy. Like, for example, how about this one? Okay, so when you're begging, if you're a Zen monk and you go begging and you are trying to be like a bodhisattva, and the purpose of your practice is like being a bodhisattva, but on the other hand, you're still kind of asking the other people to give you something. I think maybe this was similar to the other guy's question before, but doesn't that seem like a paradox though? Like, if I'm here to try to help everyone else, but then I'm begging, how can you explain or try to explain that paradox again? Thank you.
First, about similarities and differences between Christianity and Buddhism. I think one big difference between Christianity as it's usually practiced, and just as the priest said, you don't put yourself in the position of Jesus. Jesus is the mediator between God and you. Jesus atoned for your sins. While in Zen, we would make that step that probably a lot of Christians would be reluctant to take and say, well, I am Avalokiteshvara. I'm also, like when we talk about the 1,000 arms, I'm one of the arms. I'm one of his or her arms. Let me be one of the arms. Or you would even say, I am here. I'm a manifestation. While I think few or none of the Christians would say, I'm a manifestation of Jesus. Jesus was the Son of God. But it would be blasphemous to say, I'm Son of God. While in Zen, we always talk about, I'm Buddha. We are all Buddhas. And you don't need that mediator in between. About the other question, we talk about being bodhisattvas, but then I put on the begging hat and I stand on the street begging for alms. How can I explain that? Well, I think in all of the Buddhist countries, for one thing, also preaching the Dharma, practicing the Dharma is a form of giving. It's also dana. So it's not only material dana, but what we do here is a form of dana. So it's not a kind of give and take exchange. I preach something for you, now you give me something, but I would like to think that I'm also practicing dana, practicing donation. And another thing is, for example, when you participate in this Zen group, it's not that I'm making a donation by preaching and you are the receivers, but by participating, you're giving me the opportunity to speak and practice with you. So you are actually also giving something to me just by participating. If you wouldn't be here, I couldn't speak. And the same with the begging monk on the street. He's giving others the opportunity to let go of 50 cents, a dollar, whatever they want to throw into the bowl. On the surface, it looks as if they are the bodhisattvas, and the monk who's receiving is kind of like the, how do you say? Parasite, kind of, you're kind of feeding on the bodhisattvas around you. But without the begging monk or even a homeless person standing there, you wouldn't have the opportunity to give. And probably a lot of people have made this experience. It feels good to give. It feels good if you have somebody to whom or to her you can give, and they receive your gift. So actually, it's not a one-sided thing. I give something to you or you give something to me, but it's a mutual thing. It's a gift to give something, but it's also a gift to receive it. So I don't see a kind of contradiction in trying to practice the bodhisattva way and to receive from others. Actually, it can be a great help if you receive material things from others, to receive help from others. So I would say these two things go hand in hand.
Thank you. Just reminded me of, there was a kung fu movie I liked long ago, and it was like about a Shaolin master, and then his disciple was meeting this one guy, and they're actually Zen monks, but this was just a movie, and the guy asked the disciple monk asked this lay person who wanted their help to give him a donation or something, and then the monk says to him, and he goes, I'm helping you help me. And it's kind of the same thing you said, but it reminded me of what you said. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds kind of egoistic when the person who's receiving not only receives and says, actually, I'm helping you by receiving, but it's also the other way around. As I tried to say in the beginning, you are helping me just by attending and listening, just by being here. You're actually giving me something. So, well, it's a mutual thing. It's a mutual thing. So when you give something, actually you're receiving something. And the other way around. Any other questions? Anything else you would like to share? Ian, please.
I just wanted to share, when I was in Fukushima, Ken, just a few months before the earthquake, I went to a Sotoshu temple,
Mm-hmm.
and they gave out, little copies of the Hanya Shingyo.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to carry this around with me,
Mm-hmm.
just as a little pocket reference of the sutra. It's kind of nice.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Anything else you would like to ask or share? It's already 9:12 here in Japan, so if you have no other questions, I would say we finish for today. Next week I get back to you by Sawaki Roshi, and in 2 weeks we return to the Heart Sutra. So thank you for joining. Have a nice week, and if you like, see you again next Monday, same address, same time. And thank you, Xuan-san, for hosting us here and translating. Okay, thank you. Bye.